This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and to help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
I've been coerced into watching tonight's movie.
You do have books in the 24th century.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. We haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett and today I'm joined by Clara Cook. Hi Clara, how are you?
Sorry. I'm okay. I think we're all kind
Sorry, I shouldn't have asked you that. Just before we even started recording, you told me that you stopped asking people that question. I don't know. I can't think of an alternative. I feel like maybe the Bajorans would have a kind of spiritual alternative.
There's no alternative. I guess you could ask, how is your day? No, there's no alternative. Because how are you is a nice thing to say to people. Like, how are you is a nice thing. But I don't think anybody really has a good answer for that at the moment.
No.
In the UK.
No, that's
maybe
true.
Somebody in New Zealand or...
Yeah. Or Guernsey. Although actually I think they may have finally gone into lockdown now, but Guernsey, because obviously I have, friends in Guernsey and kind of keep somewhat abreast of what's going on there. They basically... I think pretty much stayed open the whole time. They managed to avoid any kind of lockdown. So like for months while we were all, miserably stuck at home, I was seeing pictures of, their parties and events and, great gatherings and all these things. And it just feels like another world. But yeah, no, you're right. It's maybe it's the wrong question to ask.
I could say I'm healthy.
You're healthy
and I'm
podcasting.
Safe and I'm podcasting.
Yeah,
that's a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and we have a topic. I feel like for once we have a topic which is, it's not an unserious topic, but I think it's hopefully not as kind of horrifically depressing and awful as some of the topics that we tend to tackle. I'm hoping this one will be, an interesting conversation, but not go to hugely dark areas. But, who knows? I could be proven wrong. We're going to talk about the Season 1 DS9 finale, In the Hands of the Prophets, and some of the influences on that, both from real-world history and from the world of film. In particular, the movie Inherit the Wind. There's a quote in the 50-Year Mission where Ira Stephen Bear says, "On one level, you could just say that within the hands of the prophets, we were doing Inherit the Wind, but I think it enabled us as a specific television series to explore the Bajoran spiritual life." And I don't know about you, I personally think that's true. I mean, I think there are a lot of parallels between that movie and the true story that inspired it and the DS9 episode. But the DS9 episode also brings in a lot of its own stuff. It's not one of those Star Trek episodes where once you've kind of gone to the source material, there's nothing left. There's nothing new in the kind of sci-fi version of it. I've always thought this is a fantastic episode, and I still do, having looked into the background of it a little bit more and the kind of history of it. I think it works brilliantly, and they make a number of great decisions. But before we go into sort of discussing it in detail, Clara, why don't you just give us a little bit of background on the movie, the 1960 movie?
Okay, so Inherit the Wind was a film that came out in 1960, as you said. It's based on a play that was first performed in 1955 as a fictionalized account of the 1925 Scopes monkey trial. So it's basically, we'll talk a bit more about the trial in a bit, but it's basically the sort of debate between the religious view of evolution, which is like the creationist story in Genesis, and then obviously Darwin's theory of evolution. And it's basically a situation where a science teacher working in a high school in sort of a small town in the South, is arrested and then prosecuted for teaching science against the law. And the law is basically that you can't teach any other science or you can't teach any other sort of creation story other than the creation story in the Bible. It's used as a medium to sort of discuss McCarthyism in Hollywood at the time. And one of the things that's interesting about it is the script was adapted from the play by a guy called Nedrick Young, who was blacklisted and so had to basically write the script under the pseudonym Nathan E. Douglas. And he was hired by the director, Stanley Kramer, which I think goes to Stanley Kramer's credit that he refused to not hire someone simply because they've been blacklisted by the McCarthy trials. But it stars Spencer Tracy, very famous actor, who plays the lawyer Henry Drummond, who is on the side of science and fighting for the right for this particular high school teacher to teach Darwin. And then it stars Frederick March playing Matt Brady, who is this sort of Christian, very religious lawyer who has been a senator, and he's been a politician and ran for the presidency of the US. And he is like the local, well, I wouldn't say local, but he's a national hero that's worshipped by the local people. And he is the lawyer who's the prosecution, who's basically arguing for the law. And then it stars Gene Kelly in a very unusual role for Gene Kelly. He's not singing or dancing in the rain or otherwise. He is playing he's playing a newspaper reporter, like a city newspaper reporter, who's quite cynical, who's an atheist, or at least you think he's an atheist. He sort of implies he doesn't believe in religion, and also is funding the defense of the science teacher and is basically seen as the great story. And then it stars Dick York, who's the young science teacher, who a lot of viewers will know as he went on to be in a very famous TV show in the US, I Dream of Jeannie, I think it's called, where he plays like the long-suffering husband of a woman who I think is a genie. Or maybe he was in Bewitched. I don't know. Anyway, either way, he plays the long-suffering husband of a magical woman. Whereas in this film, he plays a young science teacher who's trying to teach science to his students, who gets arrested for it.
And not magic.
Not magic, yes. Very family rooted in fact. Yeah. This story, weirdly, this film has been remade multiple times. So obviously it was an original factual trial that happened in real life. Then it became a play. Then it became this film in 1960. Then it was made again for TV in 1965. And then it was made again in 1988 for TV. And then it was made again as another TV film in 1999. So it just goes to show that Americans are kind of obsessed with this particular story. Because I think it sort of pitches like religious America against scientific America, and the idea of two different clashing ideologies. And how do you reconcile those two ideologies in a population? Which is kind of what you see in the DS9 episode.
It goes to the heart of something quite kind of fundamental, I suppose, for want of a better word, about, this sort of American national psyche, I suppose, which is that sense that it's a country of two, or maybe it's a country of more than two halves, but do you know what I mean? That it's very much, there are different versions of what America is and what that represents and so on. And, even now we kind of have it with Trump and the kind of bitter division in the country now with, those who absolutely can't stand Trump and those who, for whatever reason, adore him, and that kind of falls in some ways along some of those similar lines. And it might be different issues. As you say, this story was kind of used at the time in 1960 to kind of throw a spotlight on McCarthyism, so as almost a kind of allegory in a sense, or at least kind of trying to make that connection. Obviously, it's also a story that can then be transported into the future in Deep Space Nine. I suppose it's a kind of fundamental battle in a way between sort of reason and superstition almost. And I guess also if you think of, like, say, Arthur Miller's The Crucible, which is obviously famously about McCarthyism, even though it's ostensibly a play about witch trials, there's again this sort of sense that the McCarthy project is it is almost a kind of religion. It's this kind of superstition. It's this kind of paranoia. It goes against reason and the kind of rational and so on. And certainly that's what's sort of going on in the film, and even in real life. I think, the real life trial, you're right, the film sticks quite closely to the real events. The script is very heavily based on the court transcript, so a lot of the speeches that are in the film are taken word for word. There's quite an interesting bit in the kind of liner notes in my Blu-ray of the film. It has a little essay by Stanley Kramer, who directed it, and he says basically they sort of did want to essentially tell the true story, but they were afraid of being sued for libel by some of the people, so that's why they ended up changing the name. So these two lawyers, in reality, there was a lawyer called Clarence Darrow, who was the defence lawyer, who was a massive celebrity, probably the most famous lawyer in America at the time. He'd recently come off of a kind of huge case that had attracted a lot of national attention, and he was an agnostic himself, so he was kind of keen to defend the teacher. And then on the prosecution side, there was a guy called Brian, similar to Brady. I guess Brian became Brady, and Brian was indeed a politician, a former Secretary of State, someone who'd run for president several times, so again, a well-known national figure. So in a sense, it was this extraordinary situation where this small town in Tennessee, Dayton, Tennessee, which had a population of only 2,000 people, became the centre of this massive debate, a debate that somehow meant something to the whole of America, that became this real sort of, focal point for this battle of ideas, I suppose, and battle of, as in the DS9 episode, they talk about the philosophies. Sisko says there's room for all philosophies here. I suppose the problem is there isn't in these situations, there isn't really, or at least there might be room for everyone to believe what they want and to kind of coexist peaceably. But, what triggered all of this off was a law that had been passed in Tennessee, prohibiting the teaching of Darwinism in schools, and basically saying that you can't teach anything in a public school that contradicts the word of the Bible. And this was a change. I mean, up till that point, Darwinism had been taught in schools, and the textbook that the science. Well, this is a whole other issue. He wasn't in the film. He's a science teacher, which makes sense. In reality, he was actually a kind of a PE teacher. He was a sports coach who had kind of taught a little bit of science.
He was convinced by the ACLU, wasn't he, to willingly be arrested so they could challenge this law. Whereas in the film, he is actually just arrested. He doesn't volunteer himself to change the law.
No, although in that first scene of the film, there are cameras in his class. Do you know what I mean? It seems like the fact that there are cameras there suggests that someone's been tipped off or something. He obviously knows, that it's going to happen.
Something's happening. Yeah.
But yes, absolutely. The true story, which you can understand why they would change when they fictionalise it, is that the whole trial itself was not a sham exactly, but it was a kind of show trial, I suppose, insofar as this law was passed. The ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, were very unhappy about it, and actually placed newspaper ads asking for teachers who would be willing to, to kind of create a test case to debate this issue, basically, and try and get this law overturned. And another element of the legal side of the trial is kind of interesting in some ways. I mean, obviously DS9 doesn't do it. They could have done it as a courtroom drama, and they don't. They go for this much more, in some ways, more dramatic. We've got assassinations, we've got bombs, we've got, all this kind of big action side of it that isn't there in the original story. But even the trial itself, in reality, was not really intended to resolve the issue, because the assumption on the defence's part was that they couldn't really avoid a guilty verdict because their client was admitting that he'd done something which was technically illegal. What they were hoping to do was to make enough of a case and to get the right arguments out there that when they appealed the trial and took it to a higher court, they would be able to overturn this act, the Butler Act, at that point, and to kind of get the law changed. So it was a kind of strategy in a sense. So as much as it's this battle of ideas and these kind of ideologies and these two great men making these opposing, representing these opposing positions, there's also an element in which it's quite a kind of technical legal procedure, and a lot of it is to do with we have to get. So there's a whole section of testimony, for example, that the jury aren't allowed to hear, but the defence insists has to be gone through in order that it's kind of on the record, and that when the case is referred up to the next court up, that will kind of be there. That will be part of their case, even though the jury were never allowed to hear it. And in fact, what happened was, again, weirdly because of a technicality, although the guy was found guilty and was fined by the judge $100, they never got to do their appeal because it was discovered that the judge had made a mistake, essentially, in how the fine was arranged, and therefore the verdict had to be thrown out. So the whole thing kind of went away. It sort of got brushed under the carpet. But in the meantime, it had become this complete circus. I mean, you get a sense of that in the film. The number of people taking an interest, the kind of strong opinions, I suppose, on both sides. The fact that they show in the film someone's brought a monkey along outside, and indeed there was apparently a gorilla brought outside the courthouse. You know, there were singers, dancers, entertainers. I mean, the gatherings on the promenade in the DS9 episode seem very tame in a sense in comparison to the kind of wild atmosphere that surrounded this courthouse in this tiny town in the middle of nowhere. People gathered on the lawn outside the courthouse. At one point, the judge even took the case because it was also bakingly hot, and everyone was like in their shirt sleeves and dripping with sweat. And at one point, the judge moved the proceedings out onto the lawn, so effectively opening them completely up to the public, so everyone could get a view of what was happening and get a view of this kind of great debate. But there was indeed a gorilla there that people were going and staring at and saying, can I possibly, having this debate on their own terms, could I possibly be related to this animal, and what does it mean? Trying to sort of bring the idea of evolution into their lives, I suppose. And for what it's worth, when they polled the jury, when they were trying to select the jury and asking them questions, I think the majority of the jurors said they didn't actually know what evolution was. So, this, I suppose that's the thing, is this was being taught in schools, but this is a very religious community. 85% of the population of the town of Dayton said they define themselves as fundamentalist Christians, which I suppose that's the issue. It's between sort of fundamentalist Christianity and what was known as modernist Christianity, which I suppose we would think of as the more sort of moderate, reasonable, the ones who say, well, okay, we believe the Bible, but we don't necessarily believe every word literally. And the fundamentalists who say, no, if it's in those books, if it's written down like that, that is exactly what happened, and we have to accept that, and anything that contradicts that can't possibly be right. So in that town, these were, in some ways, these were quite unfamiliar ideas that were being brought in and quite threatening to people for a number of reasons.
Yeah, I think also as well, it was one of the first trials, or at least one of the only trials around that time to be broadcast over radio. So that was another thing. It was going out to the whole country. So that must have led to, I mean, in the movie they show this, it leads to sort of like grandiose behavior on behalf of on the part of the different speakers. They know they're being heard, across the country. So they're going to start being more using more oratory skills, and they're going to start being more dramatic. I think the movie has to make I think the movie has to create a sense of peril in order for there to be a dramatic centre at the heart of the story. And so that's why I think they really do make it out that this young man is going to lose, he could possibly be imprisoned, he's going to lose his ability to teach. He's engaged to a young woman who he wants to start a life with, who's quite firmly rooted in this religious community. And so it sort of puts all of his future in doubt, which is why the trial seems, they have to do that in a movie, I think, to create a sense of drama. Which
they
is why
bring in a kind of Romeo and Juliet subplot in a sense, don't they? Because she's the daughter of the kind of fire and brimstone, quite terrifying fire and brimstone preacher, who even the kind of, religious ideologue lawyer ends up kind of having to calm down a mob that he's kind of whipped up, this preacher. So they sort of bring in a romance, but also a kind of, I suppose they sort of personalise it. They could personalise that tension by putting her in the middle of it.
Yeah, and they go into more detail about the actual feelings and personal beliefs of the prosecution lawyer and the defence lawyer. There's a scene, they're old friends. There's a scene where they're sitting on rocking chairs and they sort of talk about belief and about having something to hope for, and religion and everything, which is actually quite insightful about the two individual men and how they see the world. I think the thing that struck me the most, though, out of this film, and I mean, there's lots of things that struck me. I wrote pages of notes because I found it incredibly insightful. I mean, you could link it to today's America. You could even link it, to be honest, to people's differing opinions about coronavirus, But I think one of the things that really struck me that is then reflected in the DS9 episode is that, and it's something Sisko says to Vedic Wynn, who I want to tell our listeners, I completely forgot she was a Vedic. I simply just remembered her as a really bad Kai. And so then I realized at this point in the series, she's still a Vedic. And I was like, oh God, I know where this is going. But it's something he specifically said to her, which is also something that Drummond, who is the defense lawyer, he's the guy who's played by Spencer Tracy, who believes in Darwinism and is arguing for Darwinism, or at least arguing for Darwinism to be allowed to be considered as well as the Bible. It's something that he said to Brady, who's the prosecution lawyer, which is, it's going beyond saying, the Bible is right and Darwinism is wrong, or Vedic Wynn, saying that, the wormhole is not a scientific phenomena. It is the celestial temple of the prophets, that Keiko is wrong and the prophets are right. It goes beyond that. It's that Vedic Wynn, is acting as if she's speaking for the prophets, as if she is got a direct line to the prophets, and that if she's the only one who can interpret the prophets, a little bit like how Brady, towards the end of Inherit the Wind, is talking as if God is speaking to him, and his interpretation of the Bible is the only interpretation. And there's a level of egotism there. It's you don't just believe in this religion. You're using this religion as a sense of personal power to hold over other people. And in a way, that's what Vedic Wynn's doing. It doesn't really matter if it's the Bajoran religion. It could be some other religion. It's just that she's using the religion to exert power over people, to give herself a place of power. Whereas Keiko and the young science teacher in Inherit the Wind, they're not teaching science to give themselves power. They're trying to open the minds of their students. Vedic Wynn isn't trying to open the minds of the young Bajorans to Bajoran religion. And in a way, Brady is not trying to open the minds of the people in the town to Christianity. They're using that religion as a sense of personal power. I can speak to God, and God is telling me this is how to interpret the Bible, and my interpretation is the only interpretation, and no one else can be right. And rightly so, both of them get called out, and both of them don't like hearing that. And because it's true.
And one of the most extraordinary things that happened in the real life trial, as well as in the movie, is the idea that the prosecuting attorney gets put on the stand and interrogated as an expert, as a kind of expert witness, which is, I suppose, how he's represented himself, in that he's the man of God, he's the man of, the great Christian who's come to do battle with this agnostic. But he then ends up on the stand, and I think because he was a bit of an egotist and a bit of a kind of, he quite enjoyed being this celebrity figure in a sense. He was kind of willing to go along with that, even though in some ways you can see it's a bit of a stitch up that Darrow puts Brian on the stand in order to essentially dismantle his claims about the Bible. So he goes through quite sort of forensically, he says to him, so you believe that every word in this book is literally true, do you? And he says yes. And then he says, okay, so let's talk about Jonah and the whale. You really believe that there was a whale that could swallow a man and all this stuff could happen? And he says, yes, I believe that God can do these things. And he gives this quite beautiful example, which I think they use in the film, where he says, my hand can lift a glass of water, which means defying the laws of gravity, and I'm only a man. So just think what God can do with his hands, essentially, to kind of defy the laws of nature in other ways. But then he goes into all this kind of literal reading of the book of Genesis and so on, and saying, so how long were the days that are referred to in the Bible equivalent to our 24-hour days? And they start quibbling, interestingly for DS9, where they have a 26-hour day because they're a Bajoran station. They start arguing about, could there have been 32-hour days? Could a day have been a month? Could a day mean a year? What do all these words mean? And then he starts kind of nitpicking. He has this great line. He said that there's, as well as this movie, I mean, you mentioned all these various remakes and adaptations of this story. There is also one that I would particularly recommend, is on Audible. You can get an audio recording of not the play that the film is based on, but a kind of theatre production which is essentially just a recreation of the trial, with a little bit of kind of, there's a sort of narrator who fills in some of the details, but it's basically just actors reading the sort of court transcripts, and features two Star Trek actors, Jerry Harding, who was Mark Twain, and John Delancey, who plays Clarence Darrow, the kind of brilliant defence attorney. And John Delancey is perfectly kind of cast in that role because he has this kind of quite sarcastic, quite sort of cutting, sort of withering style. And he has this, he's quite harsh. The things that he says to Brian, he accuses him of having a full religion, basically taking all this literally. You know, he's saying, I've got no problems with Christianity. I think, you know, there's no real conflict between Darwinism and Christianity if you're willing to interpret the Bible, to interpret it, essentially, to see it as something that requires interpretation rather than just believing literally in everything that's in there. And there's this great bit where he says to him, did you ever consider where Cain, Adam and Eve's son, got his wife? So it's this kind of like, you know, it's this sort of forensic nitpicking, basically saying, look, this story that you claim is true doesn't make sense. This thing doesn't make sense. How do you account for this? How do you explain this? And in some ways it's very effective. And I think on screen it's very effective as well. But actually, in reality, in the courtroom, my understanding is that you know the audience there were much more on the side of Brian, of the Brady character in the movie. You know that in a sense there's these two audiences as well. As you say, there's people listening on the radio, there's the nation watching one way or another, you know, keen to follow this story. And so they're making these arguments are being played out not just within the court but kind of for a wider world somehow, which is not exactly what's going on in the DS9 episode, but there is certainly a sense there that this debate is actually part of a much bigger political picture and a much bigger battle that's going on, you know, between Wynne and Bareil, essentially. And she, in her typical way, is really just using, it's completely cynical, she's using this dispute as a way to kind of plot almost a coup, essentially, you know, to get him where she wants him and off him, as well as to kind of whip up a bit of a frenzy and gather support. You're right, it's all about her and all about her power and all about this idea, as you say, that she has this kind of hotline to the prophets, which of course, as we find out throughout DS9, the kind of tragedy of her life is she has never spoken to the prophets. They ignore her because they can see she's not someone they would want to have anything to do with, or that anyone would. And there is this weird situation, I suppose, in DS9 that, you know, we were talking earlier about this idea of evolution as a sort of new concept to some degree to at least some of these people, even though scientifically being around for a while. In DS9, of course, I think we don't really see enough of the impact that the discovery of the wormhole must have had. I mean, it's one thing to have a religious society where everyone believes all this stuff, and that's fine. But then to have it literally appear, I mean, it's a bit like, you know, the second coming of Jesus or something. Do you know what I mean? It is a kind of a manifestation of their beliefs, a massive confirmation of all this stuff that they've believed in. I know they've got their orbs and so on, but, you know, to literally have this thing appear in the sky has got to have a big impact on that society. I feel like we don't really ever get to sort of trace that, sort of is going on in the background. But I suppose there is that sense that, so there's this new, there's this new kind of geopolitics going on ever since Emissary, and there are politics going on Bajor in terms of the kind of moderates and the more fundamentalist Bajoran clerics. But there's also this kind of threat, I suppose, from from this scientific study of something that was previously a myth, in a sense. You know, now people can fly ships into it, they can go and get readings, they can do scans. Suddenly it's not just in the realm of belief, it actually exists concretely in the real world.
Yeah, I think also as well, one of the things that's really quite clear in Deep Space Nine, which I don't think you really get in Inherit the Wind, is Inherit the Wind. There is a small conversation in when I was talking about the two lawyers sitting in their rocking chairs outside their hotel, sort of talking about religion, and how one of them does kind of say, you know, like, there's good things about this too. It gives people hope. It makes people feel like there's something better, like after death, all that sort of thing. You know, like the traditions is what kind of keeps our society together. But apart from that one little conversation, Inherit the Wind, I feel like the religion of the beliefs of the town and the sort of Christian fundamentalist religion of the town is relatively ridiculed and not shown to be necessarily a good thing. It doesn't seem to bring the best sides out of the population, local population, and that's very explicitly shown when, like you said, the preacher does his little service out in the park, and he's preaching, and then basically starts calling down hellfire on people and terrorizing his daughter. And so that's not shown as good. But I think in Deep Space Nine, the Bajoran religion is shown as being incredibly supportive to the Bajoran, like incredibly useful to the Bajorans in a time of crisis. So although I'm not talking about like the sort of fundamentalist group that Wynn belongs to, but like Vedic Baral, you know, is a religious person and a religious leader, and he's shown as being a peaceable, intelligent, understanding man who, you know, uses the Bajoran religion to further progress and find I don't know, like enlightenment, and he, you know, sort of reaches out to the Federation, you know, as being part of the religion, reaches out to his fellow Bajorans. So it's not shown as completely bad. And there are sides to the Bajoran religion that have been incredibly important to the Bajorans throughout the occupation. It implies that their religion helped them survive the occupation. It's helped them maintain their culture, you know, under extreme stress and under oppression and devastation and, you know, violence and all the stuff that came with the occupation. So in a way, there's an important point in the episode where Jake does that thing that you see a lot in Inherit the Wind. It actually happens in Inherit the Wind. Several times people have conversations about this, which is that somebody gets upset and they get angry and they sort of say, well, this is a stupid point of view and everyone who believes in it is stupid. Or, you know, at one point in Inherit the Wind, the young woman, the young love interest, female love interest, she says something like, you know, he's a bad man and everything he does is evil. And, you know, this older woman, the wife of the man that she's talking about, chastises her and says, oh, you're so young and you just see things in absolute, in black or white. Like, you know, he's not going to be perfect. He's going to make mistakes. But because he makes a mistake, you see everything that he does and everything that he is as bad. And Jake says a similar thing to Sisko. And Sisko's facing a big issue here, because this isn't just about like, you know, Vedic Wind's fundamentalist Bajorans taking over the Vedic assembly. And it's not just about like politics and religion mixing. It's also about the future of the Bajoran people. It's also about the future of like the Bajorans and the Federation together. It's about the future of the relationship between Starfleet and the Bajorans, which is really important. And Sisko has a lot to lose here, but he counsels Jake. So you think, I mean, I know I didn't think this because I know Sisko's an amazing person, amazing leader, but Jake is speaking very much as a young person whose teacher's been persecuted, you know, his classroom's been blown up, probably. I'm not sure it's blown up at that point. And he sort of says, oh, why do the Bajorans believe this? You know, they're stupid. They're stupid. And Sisko says, no, they're not. This is their interpretation of the wormhole. And just because it's not your interpretation doesn't mean it shouldn't be respected. You know, like the Bajoran religion is incredibly important to them because it's been the thing that's helped them survive, you know, the last, however, I don't know what it was like, last 60 or 80 years of occupation. So you have to respect that. And he says, what's the point in us being here if we're not going to respect each other's opinions and each other's views? Whereas in Inherit the Wind, it's awfully hard to respect that town. A town of people burning effigies and shouting like, read your Bible, and booing and screaming, and like they seem like fools. But even then, like Gene Kelly, the newspaper man, the journalist, is so snide about them. He's so cruel, you know. And yeah, I think their fundamentalist beliefs are kind of silly. But I also recognize that, like, one of the men that they interview for the jury, you know, he's a poor, like, farm worker, really. Well, he owns a store, right? But he sells farm feed for farm animals. Like, he's not educated. He's not had the opportunity to learn about Darwinism, but he's not even really that religious either. Do you know what I mean? And it's kind of like you're sort of caught in this film between thinking these townsfolk are just ridiculous, but also at the same time not really wanting to agree with the like slick, city journalist who's calling them heathens either, because that doesn't seem a very nice thing to do. Whereas I feel the DS9 episode is a bit more, it's less black and white. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also it's interesting, the DS9 episode doesn't really give us, it doesn't give us a mob. It doesn't give us a huge amount of a sense of what all these other parents are really thinking. We get glimpses of it, I suppose, insofar as we see, there's that scene which is quite interesting where they don't turn up for work, and Cisco basically says to Kira, tell them if they don't turn up tomorrow, they're going to lose their jobs. Basically, I'm not interested in this kind of dispute. I mean, there is this sense of like the Bajorans and the Starfleet people working together but not really having gelled somehow. And as Neela, O'Brien's assistant, who turns out to be the would-be assassin, says, they tend to kind of keep to themselves, that there isn't that much interaction. I mean, obviously, Cisco's trying to push this sort of integration of the two sides and this idea they can all work together. It's hard to say because, the Bajorans, not only do they have their sort of creationist belief, I suppose, that's kind of what it comes down to, isn't it? It's a sort of creationist belief in the wormhole. I mean, it's not literally about evolution, although Keiko does bring up the idea of evolution when she says, okay, so what's next? Say I agree to, not talk about this, because Wynne says to her at one point, how about you don't have to teach the religious version, but just don't talk about the wormhole, basically, just put that off the agenda. And she says, okay, well, what about when we come to evolution? Which implies in universe that the Bajorans also don't believe in evolution, that they believe, presumably, the prophets created them in some way or something along those lines. She also talks about the creation of the universe. So I suppose there's this idea, again, sort of the idea that the Bajorans are creationists. There's also an interesting element, which is seems very by the by, but Neela says at one point, if I get caught, I'll be executed. Now, she does get caught, so we kind of have to assume that at the end of the episode, she's going off to face execution. And we had in the previous episode this debate about whether a Cardassian should be executed by the Bajorans. So there is this kind of sense that, yes, Starfleet and the Bajorans are trying to work together, and the goal, we know, ultimately is to bring Bajor into the Federation. But the Federation doesn't allow capital punishment. The Federation has values that are going to be, there is going to be a serious kind of philosophical conflict here, and there's going to have to be some kind of way of managing it. And there is, I suppose, this kind of sense the Bajorans are, the Cardassians always call them backward. I mean, Golden Cut refers to them as a kind of backward people. There is a sort of sense from a Federation perspective that I guess is what Jake is saying, is that why have they clung to these things that we rejected in this sort of Roddenberry-esque, Star Trek utopia? If you think of Next Gen, Captain Picard being mistaken for a god in Who Watches the Watchers, he's horrified. He thinks this is primitive behaviour. This is terrible that they're doing that. Cisco obviously has a much more complicated and nuanced relationship to being told that he's the emissary. We see that Kira actually is quite sympathetic to Wynne up until the point she realises what a evil opportunist she is. Essentially, she's sympathetic to her kind of philosophically. But I suppose what we don't get is a sense of what all those people on the promenade who are gathering. I mean, there is a sense, just as in the film and just as in reality, as I say, it became a kind of circus. In the DS9 episode, we're told people are arriving, Quark is saying, oh, this is going to be great for business. Look at all these, fundamentalists or not, look at all these new customers kind of flooding into the station. And indeed, in Dayton, the meeting where it was decided that Scopes was going to allow himself to be put on trial was held at the local drugstore, and they actually convinced the guy who ran the drugstore that this trial would be great for Dayton because so many people would come. It would basically be a kind of tourist boon, and he'd be able to sell to all these people. He's the kind of real life Quark character in a sense. I mean, Quark is right. In reality, this did lead to this huge influx, kind of put the town on the map, in a sense. But what we don't get, which I feel like quite often in Star Trek, when there's a crowd, you do get a kind of slightly stupid mob, as you tend to get on stage or in film, whatever, where everyone just sort of shouts versions of the same thing, and they seem very easily swayed by a kind of powerful speaker or whatever. We don't quite see that. We see that there's a lot of them, and we see obviously they are sort of following Wynne's lead, but they're not even though we get these big crowd scenes, and because it's the season finale, they have the budget to like get more and more extras in. It does feel really kind of packed at the end compared to what you normally get in a Star Trek episode. We don't ever get the sense that the mob is not a threat. There's no sense of the danger. The danger comes from these political opportunists and this kind of assassination plot against Bareil. There's no danger that group of people is going to riot, for example. There's not a sense that they're going to, that Keiko, okay, she's not going to be given a Jumja stick, but they're not going to turn violent against her or whatever. Whereas in Inherit the Wind, there is this sense, which I think is partly creative license to an extent, that they make the townsfolk much more extreme. They have them saying, we'll damn him to hell. They kind of have the kind of fire and brimstone element. Whereas
they say they're going to hang him. They sing a song about hanging him. Hanging from a tree.
Yeah, violent. I mean, exactly as you say. Like in America, we had with the storming of the Capitol, didn't we? There were, gallows ready for that level of kind of violence, and the conflict spills out into something so dangerous there. I mean, I think I suppose in reality, it was more of it was a debate that was really important to people. They felt very strongly about it. It went to the core of their beliefs. But I don't think there was such a kind of... there wasn't that element of danger. And obviously in the DS9 episode, we've got the danger, first of all, maybe from the kind of fundamentalism, which... these days we tend to think of Islamic fundamentalists more than Christian fundamentalists, I suppose. Because we associate that with the desire to kill people, with kind of murderous intent and kind of violence and so on. That wasn't really there necessarily in the real story. I mean, actually, Clarence Darrow, although he rubbed a lot of people up the wrong way and a lot of people disagreed with him, including the judge who held him in contempt of court at one point and threatened to have him sent to prison for comments that he made about the townsfolk and their kind of backward ways. But even he actually conceded, to be honest, everyone's been quite polite to me here. This town has been very welcoming. I haven't had, he wasn't on the receiving end of all this kind of hatred and hostility and so on. Although you could argue in the DS9, nor is Bareil. I mean, Wynne and Bareil both seem to be received relatively well by the kind of groups of people, by the crowds. It's just that Wynne has a kind of, a deadly plan up her sleeve to use against him.
Yeah, I sort of feel like the threat in DS9 is not so much the mob, like you say, or the crowd. I don't feel like the average Bajoran is going to cause any harm to Sisko or Keiko. I think we're supposed to assume that Bareil is actually more popular than Wynne. That Bareil is like the favourite to become the next Kai. But I think that the threat comes from a stray person who is indoctrinated, who is perhaps maybe, slightly mentally unbalanced, just somebody who hears a message and then runs with it. And I think we actually have real life parallels of that. I'm not going to go into mentioning real life events where people have done that, because I think we all know. But there have been in recent history people who have gone to listen to somebody talk, to somebody speak, whether it's a political leader or a religious leader who has basically preached hate, and then that individual's gone away and committed some sort of crime, sometimes a very violent crime. And, sometimes it's not even in person hearing someone talk, like, Vedek, Wynne on the station. Sometimes it's somebody's on the internet and they're watching videos of hate speech being put out there, or they're reading, controversial, fundamentalist, extremist information on the internet, talking on forums, all that sort of thing. And then they get inspired to go ahead and commit some atrocity by themselves. So I think that's kind of what the threat I thought was happening in the DS9 episode. Obviously, it turns out that it's a story, it's a TV show, it's a drama. So it turns out that it's slightly more of a sort of thriller plot than that. And that actually Vedek Wynne has, actually created this conspiracy to assassinate Bareil. But it could have, I guess, also gone the other way, and just been a Bajoran engineer on the station who has some sort of, who's unwell, or who is very lonely or is very susceptible to being brainwashed, who listens to Vedic Gwyn and decides to take things into her own hands, and kill people. It could just be one person hearing that message and going crazy with it. And I felt like that was kind of the sort of, well, it didn't turn out to be that story, but it could have been that story. That's sort of the more like the sort of the theme. I think the thing that is interesting about this is that how everyone changes after the school's blown up. And, I felt like that was really the thing that changed everything. That's what gets Vedic Baral onto the station. He doesn't want to get involved for political reasons, for religious reasons, whatever. He doesn't want to get involved initially, right? He makes it quite clear. I think he says something to Sisko about how the prophets teach you patience. And Sisko says they also apparently teach you politics, which I think is interesting. I am generally, personally, not in favor of politics and religion mixing ever. I am strongly against politics and religion mixing. And I live in a country where, we have a state church. So it's interesting, that this show is an American show, and supposedly America's supposed to have a separation of church and state. Although I think we all know that's not actually true, judging by the amount of prayers that are delivered at a presidential inauguration. So it is written on all the American money, the word God. So we all know, I think, that there isn't a real true separation of church and state. But
even in the courtroom, I mean, in the trial in Tennessee, this was an issue that was debated. The defense asked, could we please not have prayers to open court every day, because this is kind of prejudicing, in a sense, is sort of prejudicing the outcome. But the court refused and basically said, we always have prayers in our courtroom. It's not for you to tell us not to do that. So you're right. It's kind of, and the same is true here in other respects as well. It's a weird one. Yes, we do have, there is a sort of Church of England and so on, and it's a sort of weird. I think in both countries there's this sort of slightly ambiguous approach to it all. Obviously in DS9 it's compounded by the fact that there are literally two, there's the Federation and there are the Bajorans. So it's not so much a split within Bajoran society, it's more about the relationship between those two societies, and I guess in DS9 those two halves of the kind of DS9 community somehow.
Yeah, and I mean it's two different political systems, isn't it? So, and I mean there are other political systems in in Star Trek that are also connected to religion, but I don't feel as strongly, perhaps maybe as Bajor. But like I was saying, I do really feel that things change after the explosion happens, and I feel like, I mean, Akira is supposed to sort of represent the sort of Bajorans who are working on the station with the Federation. And when Sisko talks about how we've worked together, we know each other, he turns and he looks at her because he's trying to send a message to her, because she's essentially the leader of the Bajorans who work on the station, who are in service on the station. She's sort of in charge of them, really, isn't she? And I think that her demeanor is quite different. I think, and also Oda's demeanor, Brian's, everybody's. It's a little bit like, we were willing to we're not happy about it, but we're willing to sort of tolerate protests. We're willing to sort of tolerate disagreements. But when you actually start becoming violent, like Vedic Gwyn can be fundamentalist if she wants to be. She can preach whatever she wants to preach. We may not agree with it. But if it's going to become something that is going to escalate into violence, into physical threat, that's a whole nother matter entirely. And I feel the Federation would draw quite a line under that. We're willing that you see Starfleet officers are willing, and a lot of episodes throughout all the series, Starfleet officers are willing to accept lots of different types of views, even views that are really go against their own view and go against the Starfleet's morals. But once this starts to become a situation where there's a physical threat of violence or of freedom, or a physical threat, like people are being restrained or anything like that, the Federation and the Starfleet are like, no. And I felt that was really a moment in the episode. And I think that's also for Baral. Like, this has gone too far. Like, I need to go sort this out, and he does it very publicly, doesn't he? He takes Wynn and forces her to stand where the bombed out school is And he basically does the talking for her. He takes her hand and holds it with his. And he's like, we're going to do this. We're going to show them that we don't want the Federation to leave. We don't want to hurt anybody. Because before that, Wynne is starting to get, like, she's starting to say, you're evil. She uses the word evil at one point, I think. She sort of turns from being, the emissary, which is kind of sickening, to suddenly being, I thought differently
You're
about
soulless,
you.
you have no... Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, which is like fighting words.
Yeah, I know, yeah. It's true.
It's like, you don't want to start war. Like, what are you doing?
No, I mean, I think it's interesting. Obviously, this is the episode that introduces Wynne for the first time and also that introduces Bareil for the first time. I think in some ways this is Bareil's best episode. I mean, a lot of people hate Vedic Bareil as a character. And I have to say, I do understand that hate because I think he often does come across as a bit wet and a bit sort of dull. This episode, Sisko is right. He is a political operator. He seems quite shrewd. He's kind of playing a long game. He kind of, yes, he's a good man. He's we don't doubt his kind of sincerity and his intentions, but he is being strategic as well. And you're right, he kind of outmaneuvers Wynne in that situation. So he is sort of, as much as he says he just wanted to be a gardener and he didn't want any of this, he is kind of playing that game, just as she is. Now, in some ways with Wynne, I think, obviously, Louise Fletcher does a brilliant job in this episode, as in every episode. In some ways, I think maybe it is a shame that she is so closely involved in this assassination plot, because it paints her very much as an out-and-out villain, effectively. And Kira's process of kind of disillusionment with her, it makes it quite easy for Kira, in a sense, that she finds out that this woman seems to be involved in plotting murder. I mean, that's going to resolve any sort of ambiguity to some extent quite tidily. I think it's fascinating, that scene at the beginning where Keiko says, does Wynne have many supporters on the station? And Kira just pipes up and says, well, she has me. And you're kind of like, and even rewatching it, if you kind of know where the story is going, that always comes as a little bit of a shock, I think, to find that Kira, who we sort of think of as kind of religious moderate, actually, is a fundamentalist by that definition. Her own spiritual beliefs are closer to Wynne's than to Bareil's at this stage, anyway. And in some ways, I think if Wynne hadn't had so much blood on her hands, in a sense, it might have preserved that ambiguity a bit. And as we go forward with Wynne, she does become a bit like Descartes, a complex character. She is kind of a villain, but sometimes she does good things. She's not irredeemable. She's not out and out evil. She's self-serving. I think that's what makes her such an interesting villain. She's self-serving, but she's not necessarily totally devoid of good intentions. But of course, this is our introduction to her. She's ultimately embroiled in an attempted assassination. By the time we get to the end of DS9, she makes this astonishing decision to side with the Par-Wraiths over the Prophets. And again, I've always sort of felt that kind of final section of the DS9 story, the bit that doesn't quite work for me is Descartes and Wynne, who I think are both fantastic characters throughout the series. Individually, when you get them both together and you get that final arc, it feels a little bit of a stretch for me somehow. And part of that is that it feels a stretch for me that Wynne would go that far. But then you have to remember, okay, the first time we met her, look how far she was willing to go. Look at the awful things she was willing to do. She's not just telling lies about people. She's not just smearing people. She's not just kind of playing games. She's, willing to kill, basically, to get power. And in some ways, I think, maybe it would have been more interesting if it had been a little bit more subtle, if it had been a little bit more about the influence that she's wielding, maybe unintentionally, if it had been a little bit less of a thriller and more of a kind of war of ideas. Because the episode kind of does both, but it does step up a gear. And in a lot of ways, I think that works. I think it's a great story. I think it's very dramatic. I think it does have the kind of thrills as well as the big ideas. You sort of think of the Star Trek morality play stuff. It does all of that, but it also has this kind of extra action element, which certainly you don't get in Inherit the Wind, really, other than I suppose this general threat of the mob. But you don't have what appears to be a B story initially about O'Brien and this guy who's gone missing and so on, and then turns out to be totally tied into the A story. But I do think it works very well. And it is a season finale. That's the other thing. I mean, they didn't do a big cliffhanger. They didn't do a kind of they didn't do the kind of season finale you might expect in some ways, but I think they did a brilliant DS9 finale insofar as they've just had Duet. They've got this one following it up. They're kind of saying, this is what this show is about. These are the kind of ideas we're interested in. It doesn't have to be, it ties into Emissary. It kind of brings that first season together in some ways. It has a moment of kind of thinking, well, how far have we come since we started this journey? So it sort of ticks all those boxes in those ways, but it doesn't do the kind of big, it's not the best of both worlds. It's not leading into some, at least not in some very clear way, leading into some story. Although, of course, it does in many ways lead into the story that then opens the very bold 3-part story that then opens season 2 of DS9, which I guess they probably wouldn't have done if they hadn't had this success here and managed to, really knock it out of the park for the second week in a row with this episode. And I do think it's Robert Hewitt Wolfe who wrote it. I mean, it's interesting. I'm surprised, Michael Piller is the showrunner. Normally the showrunner would write the finale and they'd kind of write something big for it. He doesn't. He gives it to someone else and he lets them write what is not a small story exactly, but it's it's very much an episodic story, if you know what I mean. It's a typical Star Trek story, as much as it kind of might then lead into bigger themes and bigger kind of sort of plot strands going forward. But I think as an episode, for me anyway, it works brilliantly, and it's much tighter than Inherit the Wind is quite a long film. It's a 2+ hour film. I don't know what you felt about it. I felt, having read all the stuff about the true story behind it, for me it felt like a little bit, I did like it, but it felt like a little bit of a slog. It felt a little bit slow, partly because all the material was basically just lifted from what really happened. DS9 doing it in 44 minutes or whatever feels much tighter and much more kind of condensed. And it's also just, I think it's a brilliant episode. It has, it's a great episode. As I say, best episode for Bareil, probably best episode for Keiko, certainly going to be in your top 3. 2 characters that often are not written very well, being written fantastically. Has really sparky dialogue, like between Keiko and Wynne. There's this great exchange where Wynne says, but Wynne is sort of saying, talking about the relationship between the wormhole and the celestial temple and so on, and Keiko says, well, yes, in a manner of speaking, and she comes back with, not apparently in your manner of speaking. Just really great kind of cutting precise lines, because exactly hitting the nail on the head. What is, this idea of a manner of speaking is exactly encapsulating this idea of interpretation, that that words are not, that this kind of literal, fundamentalist, literalist approach to words is not necessarily the key issue here. Then we have, again, Odo has this great line when there's the guy who won't sell a Jumja stick to the O'Briens, and he says, seek the prophets. Odo says to him, seek them yourself. Again, kind of tapping into this idea, I suppose, in terms of Christianity, we'd say, well, some of the Christians in this story are not acting very Christian. Do you know what I mean? They're not embodying Christian values by being so hostile to others who think differently to them, by being so kind of, as you say, by using Wynne is the antithesis of open quotes Christian values. Bareil is the kind of more, Bareil is the sort of more Jesus-like character, if you know what I mean. Wynne is very much out for herself. She's not really trying to help other people. She's not really practicing what she preaches, I suppose. And again, Odo, just with that little line, really cutting to the heart of that. So I think it's a fantastically well done episode, although I think it is true that in some ways it goes for those kind of action beats and those thriller beats, which work very much within the episode itself. But had they known where they were going 6 or 7 years down the line, maybe they would have eased off a little bit on some of those, and that could have worked even better potentially.
Yeah, sort of, if they thought that they had 7 years worth of seasons, they might have slowly revealed how villainous Wynne was, rather than reveal it in the first hour. I feel like that it's not completely clear cut in the episode, which I think is good. They don't make it clear cut. They also don't make it completely resolved by the end of the episode. It's not completely clear that the Bajorans and the Federation are going to be able to work really, really well together beyond this episode. It's a developing, evolving relationship, which is good. And I think it's also frustrating for the audience, because we can see how great the Federation are going to be for Bajor. It's absolutely essential that Bajor become part of the Federation. They're not going to be safe on their own. And they're going to be much more successful if they're part of the Federation. So it's frustrating for the audience. You know, we're on the side of the Federation. We want Bajor to be there. But it's a long process that's going to take time. So I think that probably is one of the reasons why people, when they first watch DS9, as we know from the documentary, they weren't massively fond of it, because it's not a happy, you know, like everyone's friends ending. Do you know what I mean? It's everybody's still kind of ill at ease with each other, and these two cultures are going to rub against each other the wrong way at times. But it's not completely clear cut, because there is something here with Keiko, which is that, I mean, I firmly believe Keiko should be able to teach science. I also do not think Keiko should be in any danger for teaching science, like physical danger. Like I firmly against anybody blowing up the school, right? But Kira makes a point in the beginning, which is that the majority of the people you teach are Bajoran. The big percentage of the class of the kids that you teach are Bajoran. So you can't completely disregard the Bajoran faith. You can't completely disregard Bajoran religion. Now, maybe Keiko is not the one to teach them, and Keiko makes that point. I leave the spiritual teaching and the religious teaching up to the Vedics. It's not clear whether Vedic Win is a permanent resident of the station and is going to teach the students, or whether or not the students have, like, I don't know, Bajoran Sunday school or whatever. Maybe they all go to the temples for learning and lessons, you know, on a different day. But there is a point where Kira's sort of saying, you know, like, you can't ignore it. You can't ignore it. And so perhaps maybe what Keiko should say is, there is also other interpretations, as you may learn at temple when you go to be taught by the Vedics, you know, but this is the scientific, you know, like, view, right? So, and I feel like Sisko sort of says that to Jake. He makes that clear to Jake, that there's room for, again, actually, he says it actually right after Kira and Keiko talk to him. He says there's enough room on the station for all interpretations, you know, for all different views. So I think that's also important as well. Like, obviously, Keiko should be sold a Jumdra stick or whatever. I mean, the people shouldn't, like, persecute against her. And Kai Wynn's way is like my way or the highway, and a bit like Inherit the Wind. Like you mentioned, the teacher in Inherit the Wind does say to his girlfriend, his fiance, you know, there are other towns that are also religious. There are other places where people believe in Christianity, but they're not all like this. You know, like, not all Christians are like these Christians, and not all Christian towns are like this Christian town. That, you know, I can't be me. I can't be allowed to think and believe and feel what I feel if, you know, people are telling me how I should think and feel all the time and not allowing me to have my own beliefs. But there is a point to be made that I think Keiko does kind of gloss over, which is that she's on a Bajoran station next to Bajor in Bajoran space, teaching a whole bunch of Bajoran kids. So it's a bit, like, naive if she didn't think she was ever going to come across a Bajoran belief that didn't match one of her lessons. Do you know what I mean? And it's not really even her beliefs, because, like, we don't know if Keiko has a religion or not, but doesn't match, like, the established scientific fact. And you don't want to deny scientific fact, but you also want to understand that people practice religion for a reason, don't they? They have beliefs, and you can't completely disregard them. Whereas I feel like it's kind of Keiko's relationship with the Bajoran community is sort of contrasted with O'Brien's relationship with the young Bajoran engineer, who obviously turns out to be completely and utterly, like, deceiving him and is actually the assassin. But it seems like before that, they are actually finding a way to work together, and they found a common ground, which obviously is not connected to Bajoran religion because it's engineering, but somehow they've managed to find this common ground. And I mean, that hasn't really happened with Keiko. We don't see her have any Bajoran friends. You know, she might care for her students and she might respect their parents, but do you know what I mean? I wonder if she just hasn't assimilated or acclimatized that well compared to her husband.
It's a good point, I think. And I understand your criticism of Keiko. It's tricky for me. I'm more on Keiko's side, I suppose, and instinctively, I suppose, because I come at these
issues. I'm not on Kai Wynn's side, let me emphasise.
No, I understand that. I think that's the point. But you could be on Sisko's side. So Sisko's kind of in the middle somehow. I suppose instinctively I'm a bit more sympathetic to both Jake and Keiko, and maybe that's coming to DS9 off the back of years of Next Gen and so on, and the kind of traditional Roddenberry position, which was, pretty much we don't do religion, we don't have time for any of that, all of that's going to have died out by this point. And obviously DS9 is doing something very different and is saying, no, we can take this seriously, we can respect these people. Actually, look, their beliefs are grounded in reality to an extent. They call them prophets, we call them wormhole aliens, but they believe in something that does exist. You can quantify it to some extent. There is a kind of basis to the things they're saying. They're not just nonsensical made up stories necessarily. I don't know, it's tricky for me because I think this is a great Keiko episode and there aren't many of them. And also she's really ballsy. The way she takes on Vedic Wynn. A lot of people would be quite intimidated by Wynn. Keiko's not at all. She's up for a fight. She's quite tough. She also does this brilliant thing where Jake says after this visit from Wynn, which Keiko's obviously pretty pissed off about, she comes in and she changes the curriculum, and next week she teaches them all about Galileo. So she's kind of casting herself in this role of this kind of persecuted hero of science. She's quite... it's quite a ballsy move, I think, to do that somehow. And there is an interesting parallel with the story of Galileo here, because obviously the sort of ostensible parallel is the Scopes trial, I suppose, and Inherit the Wind, because it's about a teacher and the idea of, infecting the minds of children and so on. And there are all these various parallels, the two leaders who come to town and try to put their position and so on, the two, great speakers or whatever. But there is also this kind of hint of the story of Galileo behind it. Wynn asks for Keiko to recant. Now, that is the language of the Inquisition. That's the language of the Inquisition. That's the language of Galileo's trial rather than the situation in the Scopes trial. I mean, you and I talked about Galileo in relation to a Voyager episode, Distant Origin, some time ago now. But, that's another kind of model of this sort of persecution that I suppose is in the background. And I guess with all these stories, there's a sense of what has gone before. And even in the Scopes trial itself, Darrow makes this impassioned speech where he basically... He says it's kind of a slippery slope. What he's saying is, okay, so you're saying this is public money to a public school and therefore the state has the right to say what can and can't be taught and they have the right to ban certain things. That's stage one. What's next? Next, it's the private schools where there's no financial arrangement. Next, it's that you're not allowed to speak these ideas in public. Next, it's these books get burnt. Next, it's, people are... Do you know what I mean? Basically, the level of kind of persecution gets worse and worse. It's a slippery slope towards some kind of nightmare scenario. And he says, and soon we'll be back in the Middle Ages, basically, burning witches at the stake and so on. So there's this kind of sense of whenever this conflict rears its head, I suppose it is that idea that this is almost a universal conflict. This is the same issue that just repeats over and over again in history, and the terms might be different and the exact things that are being, the specifics might be different, but the kind of fundamentals of it persist, and that's sort of the same story. And I guess that's what you're getting in DS9 in a sense. This is the 24th century. This is, in the far reaches of deep space, but this is kind of the same issue coming up again and again. This battle, maybe this is a sort of never-ending battle between, however you want to frame it, sort of reason and belief, or, science and religion, I suppose we would say.
Yeah, and I think in Inherit the Wind, there's no denying that they're all getting fed religion somehow. So I think with that, it's quite clear that the religion part of their education is taken care of. If their parents choose to send them to church, they're being preached to by the local preacher, that hellfire and brimstone of a guy. But the science teaching part of their education is only being taken care of in school when they actually get taught by the specific teacher. Whereas in the DS9 episode, I guess for me it's a bit more grey in the sense that I do feel that the Bajoran children should be taught religion too. That it's such an inherent part of their culture. It's something that's helped the Bajorans to get through the occupation. It's deeply rooted in their history. And it's, something that they, seems to affect their daily lives. That they probably are the most religious, well, at least one of the most religious cultures that you would encounter in the entire Star Trek franchise. And so because it is such a part of their culture and their religion, I do feel the students should be taught it as well. But we're not really seeing that, I suppose, is what I'm saying. What we're seeing is Keiko teaching them science, which isn't a bad thing either. They should be taught science too. So at first, right in the beginning, I mean, I don't agree with Kai, Win, Vedic, Win. I don't agree with Win at all. But at first, I was sort of thinking, well, that conversation that Sisko does have with Keiko, immediately Keiko's like, no. And I just think, well, maybe there should be some teaching of religion in the school. We don't need Keiko to do it. She's not an expert on Bajoran religion. But maybe, maybe there should be. It's like one or the other. Do you know what I mean? Like, It can't just be one or the other. Like, sometimes you have to combine the two. I mean, in our education system in the UK, I don't know about you, but for me, when I was before GCSE, which is like middle school exams for any of the Americans in the audience, before GCSE, it was compulsory for me to do religious education. Just as it was compulsory for me to do science, just as it was compulsory for me to do maths and English. I sat a little exam in religious education, and they did. I mean, I guess in religious education they weren't teaching me that Darwinism wasn't real, but they did teach me the different religious practices of Muslims or Buddhists. We went and visited a Sikh Gurdwara, and do I believe in all the Sikh gods? No, but I learnt about them because I was learning about the religions of other people, other kids in my class and in my community. Because not everybody was, I don't know, the children of Quakers or Christians or, so I think I can see that whereas in Inherit the Wind, there's no denying that they're all being taught religion all the time. And I guess in a way, I think you're supposed to assume the Bajoran children on the station are being taught religion because there's a temple on the station, isn't there?
Yeah.
So at first, I wasn't sympathetic to Win, but at first I was, I guess, sympathetic to Kira's point of view, where she was like, there are a lot of Bajoran children. You're teaching a lot of Bajoran children. You can't ignore that fact. But then it sort of tips over, doesn't it? Because then Kai Win is like, I don't want you teaching science at all, And you can't have that. You can't have the curriculum be so dominated that only one viewpoint is being taught. I mean, even in like politics lessons at school now, they teach different political theories, So it's not like everybody's only learning one theory. Because you want the children to think as much as possible and keep their minds as open as much as possible. That's what you want. And that's not what Win wants, though.
You do, and I guess these are difficult questions. I mean, the Federation, on one level, is very kind of pluralist, very respectful, infinite diversity and infinite combinations, etc. At the same time, there are sort of basic ideas, sort of Federation ideas, I suppose, and ideals. I mean, there's this point early on in the episode where Kira, I think, says that teaching science without religion or without a spiritual dimension is a philosophy, not something essentially real. Do you know what I mean? That in itself is a kind of interpretation of reality, basically, to remove the mystical or to remove the spiritual. Now, that is not a belief that's going to go down particularly well, I think. Generally speaking, in the Federation, that's kind of up against their basic assumptions and basic values. Bajor obviously is, it does have in common with Tennessee in 1925, it is a very religious community. The sense we get, we don't very often meet Bajorans who have no religious faith or who are atheists or who are kind of, agnostics or who have decided to subscribe to Klingon religion or something else. There is an element of the kind of monoculture to it, as much as there are different schools of thought and different
they all wear an earring, don't they?
They all wear those earrings, yeah, exactly.
Which is essentially like wearing a crucifix, right?
It's like wearing a crucifix. Yeah, you're right. It is. So they are a very religious community. But, as was Dayton, Tennessee. I mean, even though Clarence Darrow took very seriously the process of juror selection and trying to find the jury that would give him the best chance in the trial, he only managed to find one juror who wasn't going to church every week, among that jury. The rest of them all were. And that was, that's probably typical for that community. That's the kind of community that it was. So I think it's a kind of, I don't know, it's a tricky one. When it comes to religious education, yes, I think it's better. I mean, what we try to do, I don't know how it works in America. I guess what the intention in this country is that rather than just being fed whatever the majority religion is, you learn about other religions. So it's true, you learn about Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs and so on. I have to say, in my experience, RE classes, the only person no one becomes an RE teacher unless they're religious themselves, and therefore I'm sure 98+% of RE teachers are Christians, and therefore what you have is, even if you're in a community where actually, I mean, a lot of, I think, I don't know what the number of Christians in the UK is these days, but it's certainly a lot lower than it was before. In terms of teachers, I mean, I would say, again, I don't know, but when I was at school, okay, there would be some teachers who were Christians and plenty of teachers who probably weren't, but you could guarantee that your RE teachers were Christians. Now, what that means is that even with the best will and intentions in the world and trying to be respectful and so on, you have someone who believes in one set of religious beliefs who's trying to teach you about other ones. And I don't know, I always felt you could tell when that there was a bit of an attitude sometimes, or a bit of a sense of kind of, well, yes, they believe this thing, but, that's a bit silly, or that's a bit kind of foreign, or that's a bit, do you know what I mean? And somehow the kind of Christian religion is seen as more, it's almost like the default, like that's the sort of starting point, and we'll look at some of these wacky alternatives. I don't know, so I always had a bit of an issue with the way that RE works. I have to say, my son now goes to a Christian school, which I had a huge problem with. But my partner talked me around on, because, as with a lot of people in this country, a lot of people make a lot of compromises to get their kids into decent schools. Some people move house. Some people pay, even if they don't really believe in paying for education. Some people fake religion. I mean, at least actually the school that my son goes to, they didn't ask anyone, they didn't ask if we were religious or not. They accept that a lot of people aren't. But, some people will completely fake a religious belief that they don't have to try and get their kids into the right school. So it's problematic. I don't think it makes me uncomfortable. It makes me uncomfortable that he's being taught things as being true that I think should be, at least in an RE lesson, they're taught us, okay, these people believe this and other people believe this and different people believe different things. They're not being told, and then this this is something that literally happened. So I don't know, my preference would be that there was no such thing as religious schools, personally, because I actually think that schooling and religion should be separate. And fine, if people want to take their kids along to church with them at the weekend, then I suppose that's their business and they can tell them whatever they believe privately. But I don't really think that the education system of the country should be embroiled in all that, personally. But, they're difficult issues. I can see they're difficult issues, and I can see that Keiko, at the very least, is a bit insensitive and maybe a bit naive, as you say, thinking that she's got a class that's primarily made up of Bajorans who, which is it would be a bit like if you went to, I don't know, a community. I mean, you and I growing up in England, where it is sort, on one level it's a Christian country, but there's also, particularly say in London, there's a wide variety of beliefs and also a lot of non-beliefs, if you know what I mean. It's not a kind of religious community like 1920s Tennessee, but there might be places where you would go where you would find a community where there were a lot of people with a particular faith or a particular belief. And at the very least, I think you'd want to be sensitive to that. You'd want to be kind of aware of that. And it's true, Keiko doesn't really seem to have occurred to her that might be relevant in any way, which maybe is a failure on her part as a teacher. But, she was meant to be a botanist, so I don't know how she, not only is she forced to be a teacher, but she becomes this, I'm crusading,
surprised she's teaching about Galileo, to be honest.
Yeah.
I mean, I agree with you. I absolutely loved religious education when I was at school, but it was taught very much as a cultural subject, not a spiritual one. I don't feel like whenever I was learning about the other religions that I was learning about spirituality. I felt like I was learning about the cultural practices of other people, which is one of the reasons why I loved it, because it's a little bit like how I love Star Trek. I mean, I love learning about the cultural practices of different different groups in Star Trek. And, just like I like love learning about different periods of history in different countries. So that was one of the things I think I always found interesting. I mean, whether or not I was ever like tempted to convert to another religion was like, I was definitely not. Do you know what I mean? Like, it wasn't like, I didn't have a religion growing up. I was brought up quite secular. So like, I wasn't like tempted to become a Jew, to convert to Judaism after learning about Judaism in school. I just felt like I was learning about other people who were different and had different ideas. And that was interesting. But I genuinely think that, and I wouldn't expect Keiko to teach people about Bajoran religion. I don't think that's her job. But I agree with you. There is a certain level of insensitivity there. But I think in the way it's addressed in the episode, because it's shown by Jake later on, who, not because Jake is a bad person, but because Jake is young and he cares about his teacher and he's trying to defend his teacher and he's confused about the different ideas. And he probably doesn't like it that everyone in his class has gone one day, all the school friends are not coming to school anymore. And so he sort of says this to his father, and then his father sort of explains, you have to be sensitive to other people and their different opinions. But the problem is that it's almost like people who are trying to compromise, meeting people who are totally unwilling to compromise. I think even the character of Drummond, is it Drummond? Yeah, even the character of Drummond, who's the Clarence Darrow character in Inherit the Wind, even he might be agnostic, he may not believe in the Bible, but he's not against the Bible. Like, at one point they ask him, like, are you against the Bible? Or they say something like that. And he's like, no, it's a book. And there's some stuff in the Bible that's good. And he's quite clear to the journalist at the end of the film, like, that this isn't as clear cut. These people aren't just awful, like the way that, the journalist is sort of talking about Brady, about what an idiot he was. And, Drummond's like, you don't just condemn a man's entire life because he's, shown some real foolish behavior towards the end of it. He's not against the Bible. He's not against the messages, all the messages in the Bible. He's thinking that it's a book that should be taught as a book and interpreted as a book, just like Darwin's book. Like, Darwin's book should also be taught and should also be, he wants both to be taught. He wants both to be looked at and examined. He doesn't want to get rid of religion altogether from every school ever. He wants it to be taught in conjunction or separately, but like, he wants it to be taught with science. He wants science to be taught and then also people to read the Bible if they want to read the Bible. And I think that's kind of what's happening in the DS9 episode. Like, is Keiko against the Bajoran religion? I don't think she is. It's never implied in the episode that she's against the Bajorans or the religion. But it's that, and the same with Cisco. It's that they're trying to compromise. They're trying to say there's room for all faiths and all ideas here. And they're facing this brick wall of fundamentalism where, like, it's fun, just the title of the name of that type of belief, fundamentalist. You can't really fight that because they're never ever going to compromise with you because they're fundamentalists, like, they're never going to reach a common ground with you because they don't ever want you to think what you think, and they don't ever want you to say what you say, and they don't ever want you to teach what you're going to teach. So when, like, apart from just using religion as a source of power for her, she was never going to be happy with Keiko. What would Wynn be happy with? She'd probably be happy if all the Bajoran kids were just being taught by a Vedic. Or even then, I don't know if she'd be happy. Maybe she doesn't even want the Bajoran kids to be interacting with the Federation. Maybe she doesn't want Federation kids and Bajoran kids taught in the same school. I feel like going down Wynn's route is just going to lead to, like, mass segregation, and it leads to a situation where, the Bajorans aren't interacting with anybody outside of Bajor. And she's basically the queen of it all.
And that actually is what, quite shockingly, I think Kira is proposing in that scene early on. She says, maybe we need another school. Basically, you can teach your Federation values in your school and we'll have a Bajoran school for the Bajorans, which, you're right, is a kind of segregation in a sense. It is very much saying these two communities can't coexist. There isn't enough that ties them together, which I suppose is where my issue with faith schools comes in as well. It does make me kind of uncomfortable. I mean, it makes me uncomfortable, the idea of my son being taught things that I frankly think are wrong. And he's 5. He can't really, it's quite tricky to try and explain, okay, yeah, well, some people believe that, but, other people believe this or that or the other or whatever. It's complicated for children to grasp that, I suppose, unless that's how it's presented in the first place. But it also makes me uncomfortable, the idea of there being other communities where people feel that they can't send their kids to a sort of mainstream multicultural school because they feel that it's essential that they that they have kind of control over that, in a sense. They have their own sort of cultural environment where their own beliefs are. I don't know. I don't like that idea. I think there should be one school on the station. I think you're right. They could get a Vedic in. They could get a Klingon priest in. They could get. Do you know what I mean? They could get different people in to talk about these things. And you're right. I suppose the model of teaching religious education as kind of cultural practice, in theory, is better, because it means you can talk about what different people believe and what people do and so on in a slightly more detached way. I do think that it is problematic in practice how that works, but it's a good idea. And probably in the world of Star Trek, I mean, we don't know all that much about education. Obviously, we see Keiko's school, we see the school on the Enterprise D. Starfleet provides education for Federation citizens and others in this instance. Presumably they do learn about, I mean, they do seem to learn a lot about other cultures, so I'm sure they do learn about other cultures' religious beliefs in that kind of way, in that model. So even if Federation society as a whole is pretty secular, they are at least informed about some of those practices and some of those views. But maybe what they don't have is these sort of uncomfortable compromises and these kind of slightly confusing ambiguities where, you're right, notionally there's a distinction between church and state, and yet there are all these examples where there doesn't seem to be. And, all these kind of weird, the courtroom is supposedly impartial, and yet they have prayers at the start of every session for a particular religion that kind of, suggests a lack of impartiality. And in fact, that's the thing that Clarence Darrow says that gets him found in contempt of court, is he basically essentially says the judge is not impartial in this situation, that the judge is, kind of very clearly biased. And this is what the judge says is unacceptable. They have this great exchange where he says, the judge says something like, well, I might hope that you would believe that I'm capable of, I hope that you can accept that I'm capable of being impartial and kind of discharging my duty or something. And Darrow sort of spits back, well, I can, you can hope. And that's what really riles the judge. It's like this, it is it's contemptuous. He is contemptuous. And there is this sense of, yes, there's a kind of pluralism. There's saying, yes, he's saying there shouldn't be a contradiction between Christians and Darwinism. It's possible to believe in both, to interpret the Bible in a way that is in accordance with science rather than battling. It's sort of saying we can all get along. These things can coexist. But at a certain level, it's like, yes, there's room for all philosophies, as Sisko says, but not yours. And, and Wynne kind of crosses that line as well. It's like once you cross a certain point, it's the sort of old dilemma of being intolerant of intolerance, isn't it? It's like, yes, there's room for all these different positions, but if you're going to take the position that there isn't room for any other positions, then we're not okay with that one. Do you know what I mean? So it's like, yes, this is all okay, but not you. And in this case, Wynne is very much the you that has kind of transgressed that that sort of unspoken rule somehow.
I think they make that point about the courtroom not being completely unbiased in Inherit the Wind because the camera keeps showing the statue of Justice blindfolded. And the whole point is that Justice is a woman holding two balanced scales, right? But she's blindfolded. So she can't necessarily tip the scales herself by looking at them or whatever, because she's supposed to be blind. She's not supposed to see the defense or the prosecution. She's not supposed to show any favor to either side. It's supposed to be you. And I think if they thought that the court was unbiased, they wouldn't keep showing that image of the statue of blindfolded Justice. The interesting thing about Inherit the Wind and the Scopes monkey trial is that there was a law, an unjust, discriminative law, right? So they're challenging that. In the Deep Space Nine episode, is there really any issue? I mean, yes, Keiko maybe could get a Vedic in to talk to everybody about Bajoran religion. It'd probably do Jake good to learn some of it too, right? So maybe Keiko could amend her curriculum a bit more to include lots more stuff, but we don't know if she's not doing that. There's no indication. We don't have any clear idea of all of Keiko's curriculum, so we shouldn't judge her, I suppose. But is there really a problem? There isn't really a problem until Wynn gets involved. So I feel a little bit like in the DS9 episode, they're not challenging an unjust law. There isn't a problem that already exists. It's Wynn coming in and bringing the storm with her. And she does that because she wants to get rid of Boreal and also because she wants power and followers. So...
And it's a pretext. Ultimately, it's all, it's not genuine. Whereas at least I think we could say in the real situation, as much as Brian, the Brady character in the film, is somewhat misguided, and certainly in the film we see him really kind of losing it by the end. There's that kind of scene where he's kind of ranting and raving and then collapses and dies of a heart attack or whatever.
But he's not a bad person, though. Really,
he's not a bad person.
He makes mistakes, but he's not a bad person.
And he's genuine. I think he believes what he's saying. He's actually, unlike, I don't know, to bring it back to the present and the kind of legions of spokespeople we've had to deal with for the past few years saying things that you are just completely baffled by, and you think, you can't possibly believe what you're saying. Someone's told you to say this and you're kind of parroting nonsense. I think he absolutely believed he was right. He thought he was on the right side of this issue. He thought he could win. He thought he was doing the right thing. That's what makes it an interesting story. He's not an out and out villain. Wynn ultimately, I suppose, is an out-and-out villain, and she gets away with it. And the fact is she leaves. Poor old Neela gets carted off, presumably to face the Bajoran death penalty. Wynn gets off scot-free. The only real consequence for her, we see Kira obviously has lost faith in her. Maybe some other people have as well. We're aware, Cisco is aware that she's a bit of a dangerous force to deal with going forward. But ultimately... she's got away with it. Her hands are clean as far as anyone's concerned, and she can go on to the next unspeakable, act that she's going to attempt in her, and we get this, and this is the beginning of that story. It's the beginning of a lot of those fascinating stories that we see of her rise to power, her kind of battle with Boreal, which ultimately she ends up winning, and she does get the power that she wants, and she, abuses it predictably. But this is, I think, horrible. I do think it's a great episode. I think it is absolutely, and I think she's a fantastic villain. And I think, if nothing else, this episode brings a brilliant character into the Star Trek universe who's unlike any that we've had before or since, frankly. Fantastic performance from Louise Fletcher. It lays a lot of groundwork in some ways. It's not one of those big cliffhanger episodes. It's not bringing in the Dominion. It's not bringing in some huge plot point, but it does lay a lot of groundwork for what the show can do going forward and what kind of issues the show can be interested in, particularly in relation to the Bajorans. Yeah,
it's a good episode. I think that I kind of wish that some of the new series would do episodes like this as well. I think something where they take a dilemma that, a sort of a dilemma that I guess they are doing it with some other stuff, but like a sort of real like debate between two opposing sides that as an audience member you can't always decide like right away which one you're going to sympathize with. And then, I think pretty clearly very early on I didn't sympathize with Wynn, but I did kind of sympathize with the Bajorans as well as Keiko, and just not really. And I sympathise with Cisco because I'm trying to make all these different things work on the same station. It's kind of really hard. But yeah, it was job.
And especially, the previous episode, you had the Bajorans going nuts for this Cardassian, for understandable reasons. And you did have there a mob justice, effectively, in that the Cardassian was killed by a random member of the mob. I tend to think of it as like, wow, these two amazing, like two best episodes of the season back to back as the, almost like not a 2-part finale, but just like two really cracking, strong episodes. But they do both revolve essentially around this Bajoran, around sort of not problems exactly, but like issues to do with Bajor and the Bajorans and their sort of collective beliefs. and that's where the conflict comes from. Do you know what I mean? So there's the conflict with the Cardassian, which, okay, in one level it's quite personal with him and Kira, and it's quite intimate, but it's also, it stands in for this huge legacy of, you know, the appalling brutality of the occupation and the feelings around that. Then here you've got the sort of other side of the Bajoran story, which is the religious side. And I suppose those are the two things that define the Bajorans in DS9, is their experiences in the occupation and their religion. And DS9 ends its first season, which is a pretty mixed bag, I would say. You know, it's starting off very strong with Emissary, and then there are a lot of real, you know, clunkers in there. But it ends this season really going into the Bajorans in a big way, and exploring these two key aspects of the sort of Bajoran identity in these two episodes, and really giving us a lot to chew on with that. And then going forwards, you know, into this great three-parter that's going to really go into the kind of politics of Bajor. So I suppose the series does, you know, later on, obviously, it becomes this big war story about the Dominion and the Gamma Quadrant and everything. Whereas early DS9, the Gamma Quadrant is there, but it's almost, it makes the station an important place. But really, the show seems to be about what Sisko's mission ostensibly is, to bring Bajor into the Federation. And I think it's interesting in these early seasons that's how they choose to end the season. That's what they see as the ongoing story, is between the Federation and Bajor, that relationship. Obviously, in later seasons, that will become a smaller part of the story in a way. That becomes part of it, but it's not really what the show's about anymore.
No, and I do think that Star Trek sometimes is at its best when it is a story about the Federation coming up against a culture that's very different than the rest of the Federation. And also when it's the series, like the sort of franchise really does really delve deep into an alien culture. Like, I think a lot of the episodes about the Klingons, a lot of episodes about the sort of the Romulans and the Vulcan cultures, like, I do find that some of those are the best ones. I mean, I guess it depends on what you like as an audience member. Some people really love, you know, the episodes where there's a sort of scientific phenomena that somebody has to investigate. I personally am one of the viewers that prefers the episodes where it's about a culture and some sort of moral dilemma. I guess the series is good as it has something for both those different kind of groups of viewers as well. But DS9 really is the series for that. You know, it really is the series for like delving into a conflict and seeing different sides of it, presenting different sides of an argument, showing people in conflict, either finding compromise or going to war with each other.
Yeah. Well, the Dominion are kind of the, yes, we believe in everything, but not you. They're the kind of not you again, aren't they? Because there's no compromising with that. There's not well, you can make a deal with them if you're in the right situation. But yeah, you're right. There is a kind of religious belief there as well.
So you're talking about another blind faith. I did actually think of the Vorta, but I feel like that's a faith that is genetically bred into them, that they don't really have much of a choice over.
Yeah. And again, it leads to, I suppose, again, it's that sense that they can't.
It's the Vorta.
Yeah, the Vorta who believe in the founders and everything. Yes, you're right. And I suppose there's that sense that they're not keen to coexist with others in a sort of pluralistic way and accept, well, we believe this and you believe that. They need to control everyone else and kind of dominate them and so on. I
feel personally, this is just me though, that Star Trek is at its best when it delves into other cultures and the Federation encountering and really delves deep into other alien species rather than the episodes where the people are just investigating scientific phenomena. A lot of people love those episodes though, but that's fine. Everybody's entitled to their own episodes.
But this is a great one. I think this is a great classic sort of DS9 story, and it does really pin their colours to the mast as to what the show is about, I think. And a lot of big issues, you know, maybe we've only scratched the surface of them. I mean, this is certainly one could get heated in the Babel conference if people have strong opinions on this. I'd be interested to hear them, because we're coming at this from one perspective, obviously, you know, our background, where we've grown up, our beliefs, etc. Other people will approach it differently. I'd be interested. I mean, I don't think there's anyone who's going to be defending Wynne exactly, but there might be people who see her slightly differently to how we do, or kind of have resonances for her that maybe don't click for us or whatever. So, you know, be interested to hear it. Well, it's been fun, Clara, talking about the Scopes monkey trial and Inherit the Wind. And I don't think we went too dark this time around, obviously.
No.
So we'll see what we come up with next time. But thanks as ever for joining
Nobody
me for
died.
Primitive Culture. Nobody died. No. Well, except that poor guy in the Jeffries tube.
Oh, that's true.
Whatever his name
Actually,
was.
somebody did die.
He
Yeah,
Somebody
sorry.
died,
Sorry,
yeah.
guys.
But we don't talk about that. Anyway, thanks as ever, and see you soon, I hope. Check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they're published. And please leave us a star rating and a written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose to send to a show and select Primitive Culture, and that will come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. If you'd like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we really appreciate any support you can give us, and we hope you'll join the team. Again, you can find all our details at patreon.com/TrekFM. We'd like to take a moment now to thank our associate producers on Primitive Culture, Amy Nelson, Clara Cook, and Tony Black. Amy is a presenter of many other shows on the network, and you can find her on Twitter at Miss Amy Nelson. Clara and Tony were two of the former co-hosts of this show, and they'll be popping back from time to time. You can find Clara on Twitter at ClaraJeanMC, and Tony at AJ Black Writer.
You're blended all right.